In this video clip from the Trigonometry podcast, we have Nick Freitas, who has extensive experience, personal first-hand experience, and real expertise in urban warfare and terrorism, etc., saying some things, most of which most of us probably know at one level or another are true, about Hamas and about the situation in Gaza, the history, the intent, what it's really about, what Hamas's game plan was from the start, and also shines a light on the culpability and responsibility that, many big and influential organizations in the West have and play in the deaths of civilians in Gaza. Let's have a listen.
You've probably seen some urban combat, I'm guessing. People like us who've never been in that situation, I hear, I have my own views on it and having sort of read and listened and whatever, but ultimately I've never been there. People talk about what's happening in Gaza and they say, it's genocide, it's this, it's that. And then other people say, well, look at the civilian to combatant death ratio. Actually, this is the most humane operation in history. What do you make of all of that?
I think the people that are calling it genocide are either being intentionally dishonest or don't know what the word genocide means. I think that's very intentional on their behalf. When it comes to civilian casualties, there's a lot of people that like to do what I call Excel spreadsheet fighting. And what they do is they look at the Excel spreadsheet with Israeli military capability and Hamas military capability and say, why do they need to do all of this? Look at how much more powerful they are. The reason why asymmetric warfare exists is when you have a weaker force that is attempting to utilize the strengths of the stronger force against them. So they're putting themselves in the best advantage possible. So I did a video on this. We have a program called the Y Minutes. And we talked about what is Hamas's strategy. And one of the questions that I asked when I looked at this from a strategic standpoint is, okay, so Hamas knew when they went into Israel that they weren't going to overthrow Israel. When they took hostages, they knew that the IDF was coming for them. And yet they did both, right? So they knew they couldn't defeat the IDF militarily. And they knew getting hostages would force the IDF to come after them in a big way. So why'd they do that? And how did they know that Western academia and media would almost instantly be on their side? And the reason why is because a lot of these organizations have invested very, very heavily within American academia. I don't know the numbers for European academia, but I'm assuming it's probably significant. At the same token, they understood that the way that you manipulate Western media and Western sensibility is civilian casualties. Because even though we can look at our own histories, whether it's the firebombing of Dresden or dropping atomic weapons on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, we've certainly been able to get over our problem with civilian casualties, but we also pride ourselves in attempting to avoid them to the extent possible and reasonable. Urban warfare makes it incredibly difficult to do that. Because the fight now is not my smart weapon against your AK-47. The weapon is now my guys, and the strategic advantage is they have aerial oversight and they have body armor, right? And night vision, maybe, right? But they can buy night vision for $5,000 on the black market, so it's not like Hamas can't have access to that. And so now, if you're in a position where you benefit strategically from civilian casualties, you have the perfect environment to maximize that in a way that no other military can mitigate other than giving up. Because if I have to, I've been in that environment where you are kicking in multiple doors to try to get to your bad guy, and every other room, there's women and children. And we go through an incredible level of training in order to make sure that you hit the right target. But that's a complex environment, especially when that one time women, kids moving on, and then the 12-year-old picks up an AK-47 and starts shooting. Is that a civilian casualty or is that a military-age male? Well, in that moment, that's a military-age male. You're shooting at me. That's not how it's going to be reported by Hamas to CNN, who will dutifully report X number of children killed on the objective. So what is considered reasonable mitigation of civilian casualties? Well, it isn't warning everybody ahead of time that I'm going to go into your neighborhood It certainly isn't calling them on their cell phones ahead of time and saying, hey, we're about to attack this area. It isn't doing drones where you bring stuff down going, please leave the area, we're about to attack this house. And yet the IDF is doing those things. I'm sorry, but there is no measurement that we can utilize with respect to how militaries engage in combat operations with a legitimate and honest attempt to mitigate civilian casualties and not come to the conclusion that at the very least the Israeli ground forces have gone above and beyond whatever those standards might be. And so at this point, what an honest media would be asking is, why do you insist on keeping women and children in combat zones? Hamas is not confused about where Israel is going to go. Why won't they move them out of the areas? Why do they keep them in those areas? Why do they insist that they stay? And another video we did a while back was we asked the question on why don't more Arab countries accept Palestinian refugees? The answer is they used to. And then Palestinian refugees sided with Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait. They tried to overthrow the Jordanian government. They did help destabilize Lebanon. They've caused problems within Egypt. And so it's not that I am trying to minimize civilian casualties when they take place, but I think it's absurd to rationally look at what is going on the ground right there and then come to the conclusion that Israel's just saying, if Israel wanted to genocide Gaza, they could. And it wouldn't have taken them this long. They didn't. Now let's ask the reverse question. If Hamas would have had the strength on October 7th to do everything it wanted to do, would Israel still be here? We know what they do. I visited the music festival. I visited some of the kibbutz. I'm not confused about what they would do with similar power. And so that's the part where I get frustrated by this, because again, I understand Americans that are saying it's Israel's war, not ours. I get that. I get it when they say it's Ukraine's war, not ours. And I do believe that, again, we should think strategically about what our involvement is going to look like. But I also think that we shouldn't engage in this kind of moral relativism where it's just, well, it's just not our problem. Okay, not primarily. But Hamas actively seeking, targeting, and killing women and children because they believe it's perfectly morally justified, taking hostages. I'm looking at some of the people on the right too that are talking about this, especially some of the tough guys on the right. And I'm like, if it was your kid in Israel right now, you would not be calling ahead to see, hey, just wanted to let you know we're going to be coming in. You'd be kicking doors and beating the living piss out of people. So spare me your moral outrage when Israel wants to do the same thing. I once did the numbers. I was like, okay, if Mexico crossed into Texas, killed 40,000 people, and kidnapped another 1,500 to 2,000, and then the EU called for the United States to engage in discretion and a ceasefire, I can tell you how quick we tell them to go F themselves before we went down there and proceeded to demonstrate to everybody in the world that that was a really bad idea. So I don't want Palestinians to die. I don't want Israelis to die. But if one side gets to continually engage in terrorist operations and start wars with the rest of the world just immediately calling for a ceasefire the moment you hit back, that's absurd. And what you've actually done, what the West has taught Hamas, is that the more civilian casualties you get, the more funding you get, and the more support you'll get. We've incentivized them killing their own civilians by not demanding that they not do that.
So, Nick starts out by talking about the fact that anyone who is referring to what is happening in Gaza and what has been happening in Gaza as genocide is either being dishonest or doesn't know what the term genocide means. Right? And that's because the term genocide, the definition of the word genocide, includes intent. It includes intent, and this is true by every definition of the word genocide. Genocide is a crime of intent. Genocide means to harm, injure, kill, etc., groups of a specific or members within a specific group, ethnicity, religion, whatever it is, with the intent to destroy that group, that ethnicity, that religion. And there is no way that you can honestly or genuinely argue that Israel has any intent in committing genocide and getting rid of Palestinians and getting rid of Gazans, because if they wanted to, they could have done it in 20 minutes. They clearly don't want to. They're clearly putting their soldiers in harm's way, and soldiers, hundreds of Israeli soldiers have died in Gaza because they chose to go in on foot when they could have just bombed the whole place and sent the whole place to smithereens 20 minutes if they wanted to, but they didn't. So the term genocide clearly, as a matter of fact, has no relevance to what has been happening in Gaza. And I would largely agree with what he said, but I would add one more group to that. So he said that people who use the term genocide are either being intentionally dishonest or don't know what the word genocide means, right? There definitely are many people using the word genocide who know exactly how big of a lie they're spouting, and they're doing it intentionally. There are many people who don't know what the word means. And then and this is, I think, almost certainly the largest group, the largest subset within the group of people who refer to what's happening in Gaza as genocide, which is, it's not that they don't know what genocide means. That's not really what it's about. It's not necessarily so much dishonesty. It's not even primarily about ignorance or not being smart enough. What it really is about, what it really boils down to, I think, and this is the overwhelming majority of the people who use the term genocide, is that they're just not thinking. They're not even attempting to think about what's going on. They've committed to this, religious political movement, this anti-Israel movement, and it's become their religion, and they will follow along and repeat the talking points without thinking about it because it's their religious duty. And it's not that they don't know what it means, and it's not that they wouldn't understand it if they tried. It's just that they haven't even bothered to try and think about it. They just follow along like a bunch of sheep. They spout the talking points, and they follow along and march along in the marches, and they chant the chants, and from the river to the sea, and they actually literally, and there are so many videos of this, of people going up to people chanting from the river to the sea, and they ask them which river and which sea, and they just stare at them with these eyes like a deer in the headlights, because they never actually even bother to stop and think about the fact that there's an actual river and an actual sea that are being referred to, and maybe it would be a good idea to know which one, but it's not that, it just never crossed their mind. It never crossed their mind because they're not thinking. They're just caught up in this movement, and they're just going along with it. And it's, there are millions of sheeple who would just follow along this movement, and they spout what they spout, and they follow along in the marches, and they just never stopped once to think about any of it. And probably many of them, have the capacity potentially to understand if they would bother to try. It just didn't cross their mind. And the reason it didn't cross their mind is because their minds aren't switched on. Their minds are switched off, and they're just in zombie mode and following the pack, like a bunch of lemmings. And that's, I think, the overwhelming majority of them. The vast overwhelming majority. And then he goes on to talk about the fact that there are no surprises here. People are angry at Israel for what's going on. Hamas instigated this. When Hamas perpetrated October 7th, they knew exactly what was going to happen. There are no surprises here. Hamas knew what the cost of doing business on October 7th was going to be. They knew exactly what was going to happen. They did it anyway. Why? Because this is their strategy. Their whole strategy was to force Israel's hand, to force Israel to come and to eradicate Hamas, knowing that there's no way that would happen without large numbers of civilian casualties, particularly considering that Hamas, one of their top priorities is maximizing civilian casualties by embedding themselves in schools, in refugee camps, forcing women and children to stand around their rocket launchers, etc. This is their whole strategy. And people talk about numbers. Well, how many people died on October 7th and how many people have been killed in Gaza? Numbers without context mean nothing. Every single person, every single Israeli who died on October 7th was murdered. there are people dying in Gaza. There are civilians dying in Gaza. To whatever extent there are actually innocent civilians is another conversation. Anyone who celebrated and danced in the streets shouting Allahu Akbar on October 7th is at minimum a terrorist sympathizer, terrorist adjacent. So they're certainly not in the category of innocent civilians, but there are some innocent civilians, and any innocent civilian who is killed is a tragedy, but that doesn't make it murder. It's not the same thing. And a bunch of people being unintentionally killed as an unintentional, unavoidable secondary effect of Israel doing what they have to do to eradicate Hamas is unfortunate. It's a tragedy. But it's not the same thing as what happened on October 7th. It's not the same thing that Hamas did to Jews in Israel. You can't compare them on a one-to-one basis. The comparison of numbers has zero meaning, 0.00 meaning. Because the context here is everything. Without the context, it doesn't mean anything. The effort that Israel's putting in to minimize civilian casualties is actually insane. It's crazy. They send text messages, they make phone calls to tell people to get out of the way. Which army in history has ever said, by the way, we're going to be attacking this place, it might be a good idea to leave? Oh, by the way, Hamas, heads up, this is where we're going to be attacking you, just so you know, and you can get out of the way in time. And Israel's doing that the whole time, just to try desperately to minimize civilian casualties. And this is the game that Hamas is playing. Palestinian civilian casualties are Hamas's greatest weapon, and they're the cornerstone of Hamas's entire strategy. Which means that for every single Palestinian civilian who is killed, the culpability for that is on Hamas. And in addition to being on Hamas, it's on the Western media who blame Israel for these civilian deaths and who encourage pressure on Israel, are rewarding Hamas for maximizing civilian casualties. They're encouraging Hamas to continue maximizing civilian casualties because they're showing them that it works. And when Hamas maximizes civilian casualties, the Western corporate media are going to be the useful idiots that buy straight into that narrative, hook, line, and sinker, and apply pressure on Israel, which is exactly what Hamas wanted when they did it, and are encouraging Hamas to continue maximizing civilian casualties. So the Western corporate media and all the useful idiot students who are marching on the streets are responsible and culpable for every innocent civilian casualty in Gaza. Because they're doing exactly what Hamas wanted. This is Hamas's entire strategy, and they just bite onto the bait, hook, line, and sinker. And this is the actual definition of the term useful idiot. Most of them, I think their intent isn't malicious. Most of them, hopefully, I'm being generous here and assuming that for most of them their intent isn't malicious, but their behavior is foolish and ignorant and unthinking, and they're being very useful to Hamas. Hence the term useful idiot. And they're responsible. They're actually responsible for civilian casualties in Gaza because they encourage Hamas to continue doing it, because they buy into it and give Hamas exactly what they wanted. So they'll continue doing it again.